1 million members. Gone in just 10 years. That's not the total decline of the Presbyterian Church USA over its entire history. That's what happened between 2013 and 2023 alone. 1 million Presbyterians who walked away from a denomination founded in 1706, a church that educated America's founders, that built Princeton and countless other institutions, that shaped Reformed theology in the New World. In 2013, the PCUSA had 1.8 million members. By 2023, they had fewer than 800,000. A staggering 55% loss in a single decade. To put that in perspective, they're losing the equivalent of 100,000 members every single year. That's nearly 2,000 people walking out the door every single week. But the raw numbers only begin to tell the story. Behind each number is a person who decided they could no longer remain in a denomination they once loved. Behind the statistics are churches that voted to leave, taking their buildings, their history, and their witness with them. Behind the data is a theological civil war that tore apart one of America's most historic Protestant denominations. Today, we're investigating the Presbyterian implosion. How a church with 3 million members in the 1980s collapsed to fewer than 800,000 today. What specific decisions accelerated the exodus? Why entire churches are leaving en masse? And what this reveals about the future of mainline Protestantism in America. If you want to understand the fastest denominational collapse in modern American history, subscribe now. Because what's happening to the Presbyterians is a warning to every church in America about what happens when theological liberalism, political activism, and institutional arrogance replace gospel faithfulness. To grasp how catastrophic this is, you need to see the full timeline. In 1983, the Presbyterian Church USA was formed through a merger of Northern and Southern Presbyterian denominations. The combined membership was 3.1 million, making them one of America's largest Protestant bodies. By 2000, membership had declined to 2.5 million. Significant loss, but still a major denomination. But then the decline accelerated. By 2010, membership was down to 2.1 million. By 2015, 1.5 million. By 2020, 1 million. And by 2023, fewer than 800,000. That's a 74% loss since the 1983 peak. 3 out of every 4 Presbyterians from 1983 are gone. The attendance numbers are even worse than membership figures. Many remaining members are inactive, names on rolls of people who haven't attended in years. When you look at actual weekly worship attendance, the Presbyterian Church USA now has fewer than 500,000 people in the pews on a typical Sunday. That's down from over 1 million in 2000. The church has lost half its active worshipers in just 23 years. The rate of decline is accelerating, not slowing. In the 1990s, they lost about 30,000 members annually. In the 2000s, 60,000 per year. In the 2010s, over 100,000 per year. The denomination is in freefall with no bottom in sight. At current rates, the PCUSA will have fewer than 500,000 members by 2030 and could functionally cease to exist as a national denomination by 2050. But numbers don't capture the human dimension. Presbyterian churches that stood for 2 centuries have closed. Congregations that survived the Revolution, the Civil War, both World Wars, and the Great Depression couldn't survive the 21st century. Buildings worth millions sold for pennies. Communities of faith that shaped entire towns dissolved. And millions of people who were raised Presbyterian no longer identify with a denomination that doesn't resemble what they were taught. What broke the Presbyterian Church? The catalyst was the 2011 decision to allow the ordination of non-celibate LGBT clergy and the 2015 decision to perform same-sex marriages. These weren't minor policy adjustments. They were explicit rejections of historic Christian teaching and 2,000 years of church consensus on sexuality and marriage. For traditional Presbyterians who believed Scripture was clear on these issues, the decisions were unbearable. The denomination they'd supported their entire lives had officially embraced what they believed was sin and called it faithfulness. They faced an impossible choice: stay in a denomination teaching what they believed was heresy, or leave the only church tradition they'd ever known. Thousands chose to leave. Entire churches held congregational votes to disaffiliate from the PCUSA. Some joined the Evangelical Covenant Order of Presbyterians (ECO), a new conservative Presbyterian denomination formed in 2012. Others joined the Presbyterian Church in America (PCA), which had separated from Mainline Presbyterianism in 1973 over theological liberalism. Still others became non-denominational. The exodus was massive and immediate. Between 2011 and 2020, over 1,500 PCUSA congregations left the denomination. 1,500 churches that decided they could no longer remain. Many of these weren't small, struggling parishes. They were large, healthy, financially stable churches with thousands of members. The PCUSA lost its most vital congregations. The departing churches also took property and money. The PCUSA initially fought to keep church buildings, arguing that all property was held in trust for the denomination. Lawsuits ensued, bitter and expensive. Some congregations won and kept their buildings. Others lost and had to start over in new locations. Many paid the denomination significant sums to keep properties they'd built and maintained. The legal battles consumed millions of dollars and created immense bitterness. Christians suing Christians in secular courts over who owned buildings. The witness was devastating, but the PCUSA leadership seemed to believe that the exodus was worth it. They'd rather be a small, progressive denomination than a large, diverse one that included conservatives. They got their wish. Subscribe now if you're wondering what drove leaders to make decisions that destroyed their denomination, because the story behind the implosion reveals an institution that prioritized political activism over gospel faithfulness. The 2011 sexuality decision didn't come from nowhere. It was the culmination of decades of theological drift that had been moving the PCUSA away from biblical orthodoxy. The drift began after the merger in 1983 when progressive theologians and denominational leaders gained influence. They questioned biblical authority, reinterpreted traditional doctrines, and redefined Christianity around social justice rather than personal salvation. By the 2000s, significant portions of PCUSA clergy no longer held Orthodox Christian beliefs. Studies showed that many PCUSA pastors denied the bodily resurrection of Jesus, the virgin birth, and the substitutionary atonement. They viewed the Bible as a culturally conditioned human document rather than God's inspired word. This theological liberalism hollowed out the denomination from within. Churches that looked Presbyterian and used Presbyterian language were no longer teaching historic Christianity. Services featured liturgy and hymns, but sermons questioned whether Jesus was actually divine or whether Christianity was uniquely true. For committed Christians, this was intolerable. Why attend a church that doesn't believe its own teachings? Why raise children in a tradition that treats core Christian doctrines as optional? Traditional members began leaving long before the sexuality debates. The sexuality issues were the final straw, not the first problem. The theological drift also destroyed the PCUSA's ability to evangelize. If Christianity isn't uniquely true, why would anyone convert? If Jesus isn't the only way to God, why bother with church? PCUSA leaders had no compelling answers because they'd abandoned truth claims in favor of pluralism. They became a social club with religious aesthetics rather than a movement making disciples. The numbers prove this. In 1983, the PCUSA baptized 93,000 people. By 2019, that number had dropped to 21,000. The church was losing members through death and departure faster than they could replace them through baptism and conversion. This guaranteed long-term collapse regardless of any other factors. As theological convictions weakened, the PCUSA increasingly defined itself through progressive political activism. The General Assembly, the denomination's governing body, passed resolutions on every political issue imaginable. Climate change, immigration, gun control, healthcare, racial reparations, Palestinian rights, you name it. The church became indistinguishable from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. For older progressive Presbyterians, this felt like faithful prophetic witness. For conservatives, it was theological and political captivity. For younger people, it was irrelevant. They could get progressive politics from 1,000 sources without the cost and commitment of church membership. The social justice focus also consumed resources that could have funded evangelism and church planting. The PCUSA's national offices spent millions on advocacy, lobbying, and progressive causes. Meanwhile, church planting stalled, missionary sending declined, and evangelism disappeared. The denomination's priorities were clear. Political activism mattered more than making disciples. This created a vicious cycle. As the church became more politically progressive, traditional members left. As traditional members left, the remaining membership became more progressive. As the membership became more progressive, the politics became more aggressive. This drove out more traditional members. The spiral accelerated until only the most progressive remained. But here's the devastating irony. The PCUSA's progressive politics didn't attract new members. Young progressives weren't joining churches that aligned with their politics. They were staying home or pursuing spirituality outside organized religion. The PCUSA traded theological conviction and millions of members for progressive credentials that bought them exactly nothing. They lost traditional Christians who wanted biblical faithfulness. They didn't gain progressive Christians who wanted political activism. They ended up with fewer members, less influence, and a reputation as a dying denomination that chose politics over gospel. Perhaps the most damaging factor in the PCUSA's collapse was leadership arrogance. As traditional members raised concerns about theological drift and political activism, denominational leaders dismissed them as backwards, bigoted, or on the wrong side of history. When conservatives warned that progressive sexuality positions would fracture the church, leaders said the exodus would be small and the church would be healthier without them. When churches voted to leave, leaders fought to keep their property while showing contempt for their theology. The message was clear. The denomination didn't want conservatives. They viewed traditional members as problems to be removed rather than brothers and sisters to be reconciled with. This arrogance blinded leaders to the catastrophic consequences of their decisions. They believed progressive Christianity was the future and that the PCUSA would thrive once conservatives left. Every prediction was wrong. The exodus wasn't small. It was massive. The remaining church wasn't healthier. It was dying faster. The progressive positions didn't attract new members. They accelerated decline. But instead of admitting error and changing course, PCUSA leaders doubled down. They celebrated becoming more progressive even as membership cratered. They framed the collapse as faithful pruning rather than institutional failure. Former PCUSA members described trying to raise concerns and being dismissed, ignored, or attacked. They described denominational meetings where conservative perspectives were mocked. They described feeling pushed out of a church they'd loved their entire lives. The arrogance wasn't just about theology. It was about power. Progressive leaders controlled the denominational machinery and weren't interested in sharing power or listening to dissent. They'd rather rule a small dying church than compromise to maintain a large diverse one. They got their wish, and millions of Presbyterians walked away. The final nail in the PCUSA's coffin is generational failure. The denomination has completely failed to retain younger generations. The average age of a PCUSA member is now over 60. Youth groups that once had dozens now have handfuls if they exist at all. Confirmation classes that prepared hundreds for membership now prepare dozens. Young families are almost entirely absent from most congregations. The PCUSA assumed that progressive theology and politics would attract millennials and Gen Z. The opposite happened. Young people who grew up Presbyterian are leaving in massive numbers. Some leave for conservative churches that actually believe Christianity is true and worth sacrificing for. Others leave organized religion entirely, concluding that if the PCUSA represents Christianity, they want no part of it. The generational failure has multiple causes. First, progressive Christianity doesn't inspire commitment. If all religions lead to God and Christianity isn't uniquely true, why be Christian? Young people see through the relativism and find it empty. Second, the PCUSA failed to disciple young people. They assumed education and exposure to liturgy would create lasting faith. Didn't. Without genuine conversion and spiritual formation, religious habits disappear. Third, the political progressivism alienates even young people who are politically liberal. They can get progressive politics without church. They're not joining churches that offer nothing distinctive. Fourth, the conflict and decline itself drives away young people. Who wants to invest in a dying institution? Why join a denomination that's been fighting culture wars for decades and losing badly? The generational failure guarantees the PCUSA's extinction. Even if they stopped losing current members, which they won't, the church would die as older members age and die without younger members replacing them. The death spiral is irreversible at this point. The question isn't whether the PCUSA will collapse. It's how long the collapse will take. Where did 1 million Presbyterians go? Let me map the exodus. The largest group, probably 40%, joined conservative Presbyterian denominations. The Presbyterian Church in America, PCA, grew significantly from former PCUSA members seeking Reformed theology without progressive politics. The Evangelical Covenant Order, ECO, which formed specifically for departing PCUSA churches, now has over 400 congregations. The Evangelical Presbyterian Church, EPC, another conservative alternative, also absorbed PCUSA refugees. These conservatives didn't leave Presbyterianism. They left the PCUSA for Presbyterian churches that maintained biblical orthodoxy. A second group, about 25%, joined other evangelical churches. Many found homes in non-denominational megachurches, in Baptist congregations, or in charismatic churches. They valued biblical teaching over denominational tradition and found evangelical churches more vibrant and faithful than the PCUSA. A third group, roughly 15%, went to other mainline churches. Some Presbyterians who agreed with PCUSA progressivism but found the conflict exhausting joined Episcopal, United Methodist, or Lutheran churches. A fourth group, about 10%, stopped attending church altogether. They're still Christian, theoretically, but they're done with institutional religion. The PCUSA's dysfunction destroyed their trust in denominations. The final 10% left Christianity entirely. For some, the PCUSA's theological liberalism convinced them Christianity wasn't actually true. For others, the conflicts and hypocrisy drove them to secularism. They'd been cultural Presbyterians who left when cultural Christianity no longer functioned. Each departure represents a failure of the PCUSA's mission. People the church was supposed to shepherd either fled to other pastures or left the fold entirely. The scattering reveals that the PCUSA lost credibility with every constituency. Conservatives left because the church wasn't biblical. Progressives left because the church was too focused on internal fights. Young people left because the church offered nothing compelling. The denominational center collapsed completely. The most bitter and public aspect of the Presbyterian implosion was the property battles. When churches voted to leave the PCUSA, denominational leaders demanded the church properties. They argued that all Presbyterian property was held in trust for the denomination, meaning local churches didn't actually own their buildings even if they'd built and paid for them. This trust clause, created to prevent schism, became a weapon the PCUSA used against departing congregations. Lawsuits erupted across the country. The PCUSA sued hundreds of congregations to keep their property. The legal battles were expensive, lengthy, and ugly. Churches spent hundreds of thousands on legal fees fighting the denomination they'd once loved. Some departing churches won in court, particularly in states with laws protecting congregational property rights. Others lost and had to vacate buildings they'd worshipped in for generations. Still others negotiated settlements, paying the PCUSA significant sums to keep their property. The property battles were devastating for Christian witness. News coverage showed Christians suing each other, fighting over buildings while claiming to follow Jesus. It confirmed secular suspicions that church is about money and power, not faith. The battles also revealed the PCUSA's priorities. They were willing to destroy relationships, damage witness, and spend millions on lawyers to control property rather than letting people go in peace. For many, the property fights were the final disillusionment. The denomination claimed to care about justice and compassion but showed neither to departing members. They claimed to value community but destroyed it through litigation. The hypocrisy was glaring. Eventually, the PCUSA's aggressive litigation strategy backfired. Many presbyteries, the regional governing bodies, chose not to pursue property claims because the cost and damage weren't worth it. But the damage was done. The property battles ensured that departing members would never return and that neutral observers would see the PCUSA as vindictive and institutional rather than gracious and missional. So what remains of the Presbyterian Church USA? Fewer than 800,000 members, most over age 60, in churches struggling financially and existentially. Many remaining congregations are tiny, under 50 in attendance, with no children or youth. They're essentially hospice care, maintaining operations until the last members die. The churches that remain viable tend to be in progressive urban areas where PCUSA theology aligns with local culture. But even these churches aren't growing. They're holding steady at best. The denominational infrastructure is collapsing. Presbyteries are merging as membership and revenue decline. Denominational programs are being cut. Presbyterian mission agencies have reduced staff and scope. Several PCUSA seminaries have closed or merged. Those remaining are struggling with declining enrollment. Who wants to train for ministry in a dying denomination? The pension fund, once one of the denomination's crown jewels, is stressed by fewer active clergy paying in, while more retired clergy draw benefits. The financial mathematics don't work long-term. Within the PCUSA, there's awareness of the crisis but little agreement on solutions. Progressives blame conservatives for leaving and causing the decline. Conservatives who remain say the progressive theology is the problem. Both sides are right in different ways, but neither has a plan that will reverse the collapse. The most likely future is continued decline toward extinction or irrelevance. Membership will continue falling. More churches will close. The denomination will shrink to a remnant concentrated in progressive urban areas. Within 30 years, the PCUSA may have fewer than 200,000 members, mostly elderly, unable to sustain national denominational structures. At that point, they'll either merge with another dying mainline denomination or dissolve into independent congregations with loose connections. The PCUSA, as we've known it, is over. What remains is a slow-managed decline toward eventual death. What should Christians learn from the Presbyterian implosion? First, progressive theology kills churches. Every step toward theological liberalism drove away members without attracting replacements. The PCUSA's bet on progressive Christianity failed completely. Second, political activism isn't a substitute for gospel mission. The PCUSA focused on progressive causes while evangelism disappeared. You can't sustain a church on politics. Third, denominational arrogance has consequences. PCUSA leaders dismissed traditional members as backwards and told them to leave. They left and took millions with them. Arrogance doesn't build institutions, it destroys them. Fourth, property battles damage witness more than they preserve assets. Fighting former members in court over buildings was penny-wise and pound-foolish. The PCUSA kept some properties but lost its soul. Fifth, you can't disciple generations you don't retain. The failure to pass faith to children and grandchildren guaranteed institutional death regardless of other factors. Sixth, theological relativism isn't compelling. Young people didn't join a church that didn't believe Christianity was uniquely true. And seventh, splits are sometimes necessary but always costly. The PCUSA's fracture was probably inevitable given theological differences. But everyone lost. The conservatives who left built new churches but lost heritage and resources. The progressives who stayed controlled the denomination but presided over its collapse. 1 million members gone in 10 years. From 1.8 million to 800,000. A 55% collapse in a single decade. 1,500 churches departed. Billions in assets liquidated. A denomination that educated America's founders and shaped Reformed theology for 3 centuries is dying. The Presbyterian Church USA made a series of catastrophic decisions. They chose theological liberalism over biblical orthodoxy. They chose progressive politics over gospel proclamation. They chose institutional control over gracious release. They chose cultural acceptance over faithfulness to Scripture. And they're dying because of it. Here's what should terrify every church leader. The PCUSA didn't intend to collapse. Their leaders genuinely believed progressive theology would attract new generations. They thought their political activism was prophetic witness. They expected conservatives to leave in small numbers. Every assumption was wrong. The progressive strategy failed utterly. The church didn't become more relevant. It became more irrelevant. It didn't attract new members. It drove away millions. It didn't secure its future. It destroyed it. The Presbyterian implosion is the clearest case study in modern America of what happens when churches abandon biblical faithfulness for cultural accommodation. You can track the cause and effect. Theological liberalism leads to membership loss. Progressive politics drives away traditional members without attracting replacements. Institutional arrogance blinds leaders to consequences. And generational failure ensures long-term extinction. The pattern is clear. The warnings are evident. The question is whether other denominations will learn or whether they'll follow the PCUSA into irrelevance and death. If this investigation challenged you, convicted you, or opened your eyes to mainline Protestant collapse, subscribe now. Share this with church leaders who need to see what happens when institutions prioritize politics over gospel. The Presbyterian implosion is happening in real time. 100,000 members leaving every year. The denomination will be functionally extinct within a generation. May their failure teach us. May their collapse warn us. And may we choose biblical faithfulness over cultural accommodation before it's too late.